Hey, Tim Frisch with A Frisch Perspective here. In a previous video, I talked about Dr. Al Mohler, a leader in the Southern Baptist Convention, who wrote an article recently called Christians, Conscience, and the Looming 2020 Election. I encourage you to watch that video, read that article, just to get a real sense of where he's coming from. He is really giving a defense, an evangelical defense, of supporting Donald Trump in this election. Al Mohler did not vote for Trump in 2016, but he is voting for Trump in this election. Now, not everybody agrees with Mohler, and I noticed on Twitter this thread by someone named Michael Weir, who was actually a faith advisor in the Obama administration. So I'm going to contrast Mohler today by reading some of what Michael Weir has to say, just to show a different side. He really reacts strongly to what Mohler wrote, so I thought it would be interesting to look at that a little bit. Before I do, I just want to remind you that if you enjoy Christian nerdy content like this, then subscribe to this channel and hit the bell notification so that you know when I upload a new video. So let's read what Michael Weir wrote in this Twitter thread. He says, Al Mohler once again makes his case for Trump. Looks like he felt he needed to repeat what he said before in light of Piper's post last week. And he's referencing John Piper's post, which was basically saying that he's not going to vote for either presidential candidate. Weir goes on, I won't comment on all of it now, but here's one observation. So again, this is in reference to Al Mohler's article. And he wrote this on October 26, by the way. He says, after Mohler summarizes evangelical support for Trump as a worldview issue and says he quickly loses respect for pro-lifers who support Biden, he takes a different approach to black Christians who vote Democratic. He doesn't agree with them, he says, but they have historical reasons, so they're still brothers and sisters in Christ. Mohler doesn't consider those reasons in his redundant apologetic for Trump. They have their reasons, we have ours. This seems to be his line. This is Mohler's Christian worldview applied to 2020. 2,500 words on abortion, religious freedom, and LGBT issues, all in service of justifying support for a man whose life has undermined evangelical convictions on these issues and whose politics are a disaster for them long term. After a couple paragraphs dismissing white evangelicals who support Biden, his big olive branch is to tell black Christians that he still considers them Christians because their vote is for historical reasons. Mohler does not consider that those historical reasons might apply to everyone, that he too might consider the historical reasons that would motivate so many pro-life, pro-religious freedom black Christians to support Biden as reasons for him too. He certainly can't fathom that these historical reasons might motivate many white evangelicals in this election. They're betraying their tribes, so they don't even get Mohler's affirmation of Christian brotherhood. With all respect, Mohler's argument does not reflect a full, robust Christian worldview applied to this election. If it did, he'd name out loud those areas of Trump's policies where he disagrees, those historical reasons, and say, in light of all this, I still support Trump. While he criticizes pro-life evangelicals for Biden, they did what he is unwilling to do. He lies in this post when he says they fail to concede a Biden administration will advance policies they disagree with on the issues Mohler cares about. In fact, they do so explicitly. What Mohler falsely accuses them of not doing, he is unwilling to do himself, at least in this post, at least when he's making the case for Trump and arguing it's beyond his moral imagination to vote for Biden before patronizingly making an exception for black Christians. That's all I have to say about this post. This election is in 8 days. There's going to be a lot of dumb things said over this next week. Christians must think Christianly when they vote, but we ought to be hesitant before making the way we vote a matter of faithfulness. So what I'm really sensing in that Twitter thread from Michael Weir is really offense that he's taken. And particularly, I think it's in this part of Mohler's presentation where Mohler says, I quickly lose respect for those who now endorse Joe Biden while claiming to save the pro-life cause or the conservative movement. A little later, Mohler says, there will be evangelicals who cannot in good conscience vote for Donald Trump. I understand their predicament, but not voting for Donald Trump, though a political decision in itself, is not the same as voting for Joe Biden. This is beyond my moral imagination. So what I'm gathering is that Michael Weir is probably planning to vote for Biden in this election, and he's really put off by Mohler saying that you're not a faithful Christian. In some sense, he's kind of implying you're not a faithful Christian if you are voting for Biden. Now, Al Mohler does clarify in his presentation that he understands why black voters, black evangelicals even, might vote for Biden. He says, I also recognize that I know brothers and sisters in Christ who see this differently. The vast majority of black voters in America vote regularly and predictably for the Democratic ticket and have since 1960. Like the pattern of white evangelical voting, this is not a surprise. There are long historical reasons why both are so. With my black brothers and sisters, I make my best case for how I see the issues. They have every right to do the same. We each have a vote. Both of us will answer to God for that vote. We earnestly seek to persuade the other. We will likely vote differently in the end. We remain brothers and sisters in Christ. We're really zeroed in on that phrase, historical reasons why black Christians would tend to vote Democratic Party. And Weir says, well, those are also historical reasons why white Christians would vote for the Democratic Party. And Weir sees this as really being patronizing to black Christians. And so it's really interesting to see that just the perception of how people hear things. And I know some of you, when I talked about Al Mohler in that last video, some of you really agreed with him, some of you disagreed with him. And I think it's because of how people hear another person. And especially it's easy for us to misread people when we're coming from a different vantage point, and we have a lot of emotional investment in a different vantage point. So I think that's really coming out here. One pushback I'm really going to give on Michael Weir's Twitter thread here is where he talks about Mohler, his worldview applied to 2020, 2,500 words on abortion, religious freedom, LGBT issues, all in service of justifying support for a man whose life has undermined evangelical convictions on these issues and whose politics are a disaster for them long term. Now, I understand what he's saying. He's saying Trump is such a bad person in his character that he's ultimately going to have bad effects for the politics that conservatives are trying to push for. He thinks long-term it's going to have bad results. Skye Jitani also talked about how who you vote for president doesn't impact something like abortion as much as you think it would. And my pushback for these kinds of statements is this, that when you actually look at President Trump over the past few years, and I know there are a lot of criticisms that he's received, and probably deservedly so, for things he's said and done. However, if you actually look at the impact he has, think about the Supreme Court. And I think the Supreme Court is a real strong point, kind of pushing back against what evangelicals for Biden are saying. I think the Supreme Court has shown that the president does have an impact on politics, and that's not only right now, but the Supreme Court justices usually are on the Supreme Court for a long time, so that's going to have an impact far into the future. And I know that's why a lot of people voted for Trump originally. They said, well, he's going to put more conservative justices on the Supreme Court, and now the Supreme Court is leaning, at least on paper, more conservative. So imagine if we had had Hillary Clinton in office, what the Supreme Court would look like. Now, I know there are a lot of people that don't like the makeup of the Supreme Court as it is right now, but you have to admit, for people that are more conservative, regardless of what anybody thinks about Trump, his demeanor, his character, all of that, I think he certainly has had an impact. And so what Michael Weir is saying is, yeah, but it's going to have a negative impact in the long run. Well, to some degree, that might be true. But something like the Supreme Court and various other causes that Trump has stood for would speak against that. But aside from all of that, I really just wanted to give an opposing viewpoint to what Al Mohler said and just talk about how do we listen to each other. And as you can tell, when Michael Weir was reading Al Mohler, he heard him in a certain way, and he really took offense by it. I think that is so easy to do right now at this point in the political season. It's easy to take offense at what people are saying. It's easy sometimes to even read into what they're saying and to judge them, their motives for what they're saying. And to be honest, I see that sometimes in the comments. It's one thing to judge what a person says. It's another thing to judge their motives. When you really don't read their mind, you don't really know why they're doing what they're doing. We have to be really careful of that. But I do really like for people to be able to express their viewpoints, give the information that supports the side that they feel is correct. So feel free to do that in the comments. Just make sure you keep those comments helpful, edifying to discussion. But thank you as always for listening to some of my thoughts from a Frisch Perspective.